I appreciate your patience with today's technical problems. We contacted IT and the projector should be up and running for next class. What I'm going to try to do right now is to provide you with a short, simple video that will touch the high points of what was going to be today's introduction. We'll make sure that we answer any questions that you might have at the beginning of next class. So what I want to do right now is introduce to you broad notions of typography, and think of typography as how we use fonts as a visual design element in our writing and publications. Now, typography can be viewed as a graphical treatment of information, and the fonts that we select will have different impacts upon our readers. So this is going to be a high-level introduction to typography, and we'll get into much more detail in class within a couple weeks. So, definitions. Typography is a term that also includes handwriting forms. So typography could be the fonts that you see on a computer screen, or it could be the shape of the letters that you use in your handwritten text. Typography also refers to the use of fonts and typefaces in documents along with their arrangement and association with various white space considerations. So when I'm looking at this particular slide and I'm going to talk about its typographical conventions, what I'll probably describe is the fonts that I use. In this case, I'm using Arial, a sans serif font. We'll cover that in a moment. I'm also double spacing between each bulleted line, and that double space, that emptiness, is called a white space. And what we do when we describe typography is look at not only the letters that are present in our design, but also the places of absence, the white space in our document, to make sure that the white space reinforces our text and vice versa. Fonts can refer to the weight or style of a family of fonts. A font could be bold, italics, or underlined. And there's lots of different groupings of different font families that we can look at in our examination of typography. We'll go over those in much more detail. But by and large, we have 6 basic types of fonts that we're working with, 2 of which are incredibly important, and the other 4 deal more with visual design. So we have serif fonts like Cambria, and the serif fonts have, associated with the endings, the edges of the letters, little ascending and descending elements. We'll talk about that in a moment. Monospaced fonts have equal spacing between each letter, regardless of the letter's width. And this can be difficult to read, depending upon the words that you're conveying in your document and the length of the sentences. Brush script is something that's a little more artistic and formal. Notice in a brush script that you have the individual letter elements are connected to one another, whereas cursive, you have a similar visual design, but the individual letters are separate from one another. A sans serif font is pretty much the opposite of a serif font. So an example of a serif font is Cambria. It has those little ascenders and descenders at the end of the C's. Notice in sans serif fonts, these are fonts without serifs, without these ascenders and descenders. So generally, when we're working in technical documentation and business communication, we focus primarily on serif and sans serif font families. The font that you choose will convey a different message to your audiences. Let me try that again. Fonts that you choose convey different messages to your audiences. So if I want a really simple, generic, easy to read font, I would choose, a sans serif font like Calibri or Arial right here. You see my name, Don Vesio, no ascenders and descenders, easy to read, really clean, maps well. If I want something a little more artistic and formal, this is something I generally won't do in business documentation, then I'll use a script font, and notice how the letters are linked together. This is a font family called Broadway. Again, this really emphasizes the visual appeal of the font, which sometimes can make it more difficult to actually read the text that the font is spelling out. A little more informal, Comics sans serif. Here's a very classy font that is a cursive font, and notice that the letters aren't connected together And this will lead to some degree of formality. I might use a cursive or a script font as a faux signature in my documentation. And the bottom example is another font. This is more of a digital computer type font that sends a message that might associate the text with different technologies. Right now, all I want you to be thinking about is that the fonts that you select will promote various emotional responses on the part of your audience, and that in general you're going to be playing with one of two different types of font families. You're going to deal with either serifed or sans serif fonts. Now, more detailed, what we're talking about with serifs and sans serif fonts is the presence of additional elements at the various endpoints of a letter. So if you look at serif font, the letter T, this is Times New Roman. You have the extenders on the top right, top left of the font, as well as bottom left, bottom right of the letter T. If you compare it to the sans serif, there aren't those ascenders and descenders. So remember, sans serif without ascenders and descenders, serifed has them. Now, the presence of ascenders and descenders are important for more than their visual appeal. When you have ascender and descender in a sans serif font, what it does do visually is help the reader link individual letters together to form words. In other words, it helps readers speed up the reading process, and it makes information a little easier to obtain. If you take the serifs up off, like this example of Arial T, sans serif, then what happens is that you are slowing the reading process down because individual letters aren't linked next to one another. So what this does, sans serif fonts do, is it slows reading down and really focuses your reader's attention on a specific element of your document design. So in the case of a resume, when I am producing my heading, where I have my name and my contact information and stuff on the top of the document, I'm going to really want my readers to pause, focus on my name. So I'd use a sans serif font like Arial, bold. What that will do is slow the reading down by disaggregating, disconnecting letters from one another. And then as a reader looks at your name in a sans serif font, what they'll do is look at every individual letter separately and then link them together to form a word. That's a way of slowing your readers down to have them pay attention. The rest of the text I would probably use a serif font. So any extended descriptions, job responsibilities, education, things like that. In other words, when I'm presenting a fair amount of information, a fair amount of continuous information especially, then I'd use a serif font. Again, that speeds reading up. It makes information easier to acquire. So within the context of a resume, use a sans serif font for your name and any section headings like summary, education, experience, special skills, anything that you want to set off from the rest of the text and cause your readers to pause and take note, use a sans serif font. And then when you're presenting a fair amount of information and that you want your readers to go through this information in a relatively quick and smooth manner, then you would use a serif font that links letters together. So in my document designs, in the simplest way possible, what I would probably use is two different types of font. For my name and for my section headings, I would use a sans serif font like Arial. And for the bulk of my information text, what I would probably do is use a serif font like Times New Roman. That's a simple way of helping your readers focus on key elements. Key elements are usually labels, and then labels in turn make it easier for people to read continuous information. So as a last example, I have these two texts with identical language. The content, the word choice, everything is the same. But notice by going from a simple sans serif font on the right to something a little more complex on the left, the complexity looks appealing and might even reinforce the content in terms of its thematic importance, but it's harder to read. On the right-hand column, where you're using a very simple font like Arial, incredibly simple to read. The last thing I'd like to emphasize is that when I'm writing in print format, I will do a mix of sans serif, like Arial, and a serif font, like Times New Roman. Again, sans serif for big heading items, serif for paragraphs and information. But when I'm writing on the screen, on a computer monitor, or for a phone, or for a tablet, or for a laptop, then I'm going to use sans serif fonts exclusively because they render much more clearly in a digital format. So if you're writing just for the screen, use a sans serif font. If you're writing for email, sans serif font. If you're writing a resume that's going to be scanned electronically, use sans serif fonts. Again, it's because in most instances, the resolution of a printed document will be a bit higher than that on the screen, and it's a lot easier to decode your font choice on the screen by simplifying its constructions. I hope this makes sense. But basically, all I really wanted to introduce today is that we select our fonts for both functional and formal characteristics. Functional, how easy it is to make text readable for one's audience, and whether you're using the font to slow reading down or speed it up. In terms of its formal characteristics, different font choices will carry with it different emotional associations. So if I was doing my name on a wedding invitation or something, I'd probably use a script of this sort. And if I was going to be pretty formal, I'd use a standard sans serif. You get the idea. So be careful in your font selection. Within the context of your resume, your name and section headings go sans serif, in this case Arial, and anything else, especially continuous text, then what you would do is use a serif font like Times New Roman. Again, I apologize, I rushed kind of quickly through this first part of the lesson, but again, we'll pick up next class and review any potential questions that you might have.